This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back. I'm Rebecca Larson, and once again, I am joined by the very lovely, very friendly, very knowledgeable Matt Lewis. Welcome.
I don't know what all that build-up is for. Is that because I just threatened to kill people? I don't know.
Yeah.
Before we started recording.
Yeah, I needed to soften it.
It's definitely nothing personal. Yeah, no. It's great to be back. Thank you very much for having me again.
Yes, we've been taking a wild journey, and I keep asking you back because I feel like we have to continue the story of the monarchy during the medieval period because we can't.
For my sparkling company and my witty repartee, just because you feel you have to have me back. I mean, thank you.
I'm sorry. No. I like you. I do. I'm just so excited that I'm learning about this stuff from you, and the fans have been enjoying it. They get so excited when you return on Thursday, and I think they're enjoying the stories just as much as I am. And, we've worked our way through. Last week, we talked about Edward I and whether we like him or we don't like him. Was he good or was he bad? And now this week, we're looking at his son, Edward II. And I don't know how to feel about him. I started thinking in my head, comparing him to his ancestors. Like, who is he closest to? And I want to say from what I've read, he seems closest to John.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of asks a lot of the same questions that you just said about Edward I. Do we like him or not? Was he a good guy or not? We can ask a lot of those same questions about Edward II, I think, and come up with possibly the same answers, maybe different answers, but for very different reasons. He's such a contrast to his dad. Where I would differentiate him from John, maybe, he goes down in the list of failures as a king. Where I would differentiate him from John is that Edward II is, I think, someone you might quite like to sit down and have a beer with, whereas John definitely isn't. He's the guy in the pub that everyone's avoiding. He's in John Corner over there on his own. Edward II he seems like a really nice bloke, and the issue that we have is that nice blokes often don't make very good medieval kings. He seems like the kind of guy, as I say, you could go and have a drink with, you could have a bit of a laugh with. One of the things that comes out in the chronicles, when they talk about Edward II, they tell us that he's a tall guy, he's really well built, muscular kind of guy, very good looking. His contemporaries considered him good looking, although you'll probably note that very few kings are ever called ugly in the chronicles because that doesn't tend to go down very well. But they comment on him being very good looking, but they pick out this tendency that he had to hang out with ordinary people. That's gross. And they can't understand it, and they don't like it, and they think it's very unkingly behavior. But I'm not sure that we would today. So I picked out a couple of quotes that people say about him. So one chronicler wrote that from his youth, he devoted himself in private to the art of rowing and driving carts, of digging ditches and thatching houses, as was commonly said, and also with his companions at night in various works of ingenuity and skill, and to other pointless, trivial occupations unsuitable for the son of a king. Mm. And somebody else, another writer goes on that Edward forsook the company of lords and drew himself to harlots, to singers and to jesters, to carters, to ditchers and to dykers, to rowers, shipmen and boatmen, and to other craftsmen, and gave himself to great drinking. So he liked to go down the pub with his mates and have a drink. He liked to go and engage in kind of physical pursuits. He liked rowing. He liked digging ditches. He liked thatching roofs and things like that. And these are all things that, to me, I'm thinking, well, what's wrong with all of that? But his contemporaries see that as very unroyal, unkingly, unprincely behavior. It's not what they expect from him. And I think that's the weird juxtaposition that we have with Edward. He's really difficult to pin down. His reign is undoubtedly disastrous, but not because he's a horrible bloke like John was.
He seems so different from his father, and it seems like at the end of Edward I's reign, he tried to maybe take his son under his wing and kind of teach him some things, but that didn't seem to rub off on him, did it?
No, it didn't. Edward I does involve Edward II in his military campaigns, particularly to Scotland. So in the final years of Edward I's reign, Prince Edward II, is getting kind of really involved in all of those sorts of stuff. He's acted as regent in England in the late 1290s when Edward I goes to France. He goes on campaign to Scotland in 1300 and in 1301, which is the same year that he's created Prince of Wales. So, his dad's involving him in all of his political ideas. The suppression of Wales is embodied in Prince Edward. And again, in kind of 1303, 1304, he's back in Scotland campaigning with his dad. He's involved in the siege of Stirling that his dad undertakes in 1304. So Edward I is definitely giving him the kind of training that he's likely to need. If he's seeing his dad working at first hand, he's seeing that, the hammer of the Scots trying to hammer the Scots. And he's doing a bit of learning on the job. But, we also see a bit of friction between the two of them. So Edward I comes across as quite a kind of authoritarian, slightly aggressive figure. And that seems to bear out in his relationship with his son. So we also need to remember that, Edward II is the last son that Edward I had. He's lost 4 sons before that. So all of his eggs are very much now in this one basket. So if he's being harsh on Edward II, that might be what's going on here. This is Edward I's last chance. He's not going to get another go at this. Although he does have sons from a second marriage. So, maybe he's got a little bit of cover there. But he's investing a lot in Edward. But, 1305, so the year after they've been up in Scotland, he falls out with his dad, apparently over money. He wants more money to live off from his dad. And Edward and his friends, his young male friends, are kind of all banished from the court of Edward I. And eventually we're told it takes family negotiations, like everybody gets involved to try and reconcile them. And they do get, back onto terms again. But there seems to be friction in that relationship. So we also know that just before the end of his reign, Edward I banishes Piers Gaveston. And that doesn't seem to be because he doesn't like Piers Gaveston or has an issue with Piers Gaveston. His issue seems to be that his son is becoming too reliant and too attached to this man. So he's kind of not blaming Piers Gaveston for it. He's blaming his son and sending Piers away to try and break that link between the two of them, which is a link that affects the whole of the rest of Edward II's life and all of his reign. But then, we see 1306 when, as we mentioned last time, Robert the Bruce makes himself King of Scotland. Edward kind of responds by making his son Prince of Aquitaine and having him knighted. And Edward, by this stage, is becoming increasingly ill as well. So he must have been aware that he's now preparing his son, who's in his mid-20s, to be the next King of England. Anytime now, imminently, he's going to have to pick up this war with Scotland. And Edward I must have hoped that his son was going to be able to finish it. I mean, hindsight will tell us that he couldn't.
I love these stories, and I look at Edward I and look at his son Edward II. Like I said, I feel like they're so different, and it almost makes more sense now knowing that Edward II had older brothers, and that he probably, and I guess I don't know how long those older brothers lived, but he probably never intended that he was going to be king in the future.
No, I mean the first two I think passed away very young. The third, Alfonso, lived for a bit longer. So we nearly had a King Alfonso I of England at that point. So we mentioned the oldest son he called John, so we nearly did get a King John II. And we almost had a King Alfonso as well. But yeah, so there's potentially reasons why Edward I and Edward II's relationship was difficult. But it becomes, really clear once Edward I dies in the summer of 1307, while he's heading up to Scotland, it becomes almost instantly clear that his son is not him and has not picked up those lessons that his dad has been desperately trying to impart. Edward II kind of almost immediately abandons any attempt to go to Scotland, focuses his efforts on getting control of London. One of the very first things that he does as king is bring Piers Gaveston back to England again. Piers is from Gascony. He's a few years older than Edward, and someone who Edward has this attachment to. And people kind of obsess over whether that was a sexual relationship. I don't know. It probably was. Almost certainly, Edward describes loving Piers like a brother on occasions. And probably there was a sexual relationship between them as well, but that's something we would really struggle to pin down.
Yeah.
But kind of the very early signals from his reign are that Piers is going to be a problem. All of the barons hate Piers. And that's largely because of the amount of influence he has over the king. History tells us anyone who has influence over the king is generally hated by anybody else. But Piers also, he came up with nicknames for all of the barons that he and Edward would joke and call them names, which obviously didn't go down very well with all of them, who like to think of themselves as prestigious. Before the end of 1307, so December 1307, 6 months into Edward's reign, he goes over to France to get married, and he makes Piers kind of keeper of the realm while he's out of England. So, while all these old family barons are sitting around going, excuse me?
Yeah.
What about us?
Yeah.
Piers is given this kind of plum job, put in charge of England effectively. And again, I picked out a quote. There's so many great quotes about Edward II's reign. So I picked out another quote from a chronicle. This was an anonymous chronicler, but he commented that he who had lately been an exile and outcast from England should now be made ruler and guardian of the realm. And he's kind of giving voice to that idea that, this is a guy who Edward I sent out of the country, and Edward II is now putting him in charge of the country. I mean, they couldn't be a better demonstration of just how different they really were.
Yeah. Okay, so we have to talk about his wife, obviously, because I feel like she is such an important part of his story. So where does she come in? Isabella
is such a fascinating character, and she is, absolutely key to this story in lots and lots of interesting ways. So the reason that Edward is heading over to France in December 1307 is to marry Isabella, who is a daughter of Philip IV of France. She will have, three of her brothers will successively become kings of France because they don't live very long and they don't have children that survive either. So she's a French princess. England has been having all kinds of trouble with France, particularly over control of Gascony. That has been a pain throughout Edward I's reign, that he's kind of pulled in all of these different directions between Wales, Scotland and France. So the idea of this marriage is that it will shore up the kind of the southern border, and it should allow England, Edward, to focus more on the war with Scotland and completing that. But again, there are kind of really early signals. So aside from the marriage, while they're over in France, while the marriage is going on, at the end of January, a bunch of the English barons present Edward II with this thing called the Boulogne Agreement, which is a whole load of clauses. The actual document doesn't survive, so it's really unclear what it actually says and what it intended to do. But it essentially appears to have tried to separate the idea of being loyal to the crown from allegiance to the person of the king, so that the institution of the monarchy kind of becomes separate from the person who's sitting on the throne right now. And it's hard not to imagine that this is the barons with alarm bells ringing and them thinking, is this John again?
Yeah, exactly.
We want to be loyal to the crown, but we don't want to have to be loyal to someone who is a complete idiot and is going to cause untold problems by demanding our loyalty. And I guess it works as another mechanism of control over the king, because if he feels like the barons don't have to be loyal to him, they only have to be loyal to the crown, then they could turn on him, and it sort of acts as a little bit of a warning as well. And when they get back to England in kind of early 1308, Edward and Isabella are crowned together at Westminster Abbey, and the place of highest prominence at the coronation is given to Piers Gaveston. of course.
Of course.
Alarm bells ringing everywhere. A few days after the coronation, Parliament opens, and loads of the earls and the barons kind of refuse to work with Piers Gaveston, and they essentially say that they are going to, resist Edward for as long as Piers Gaveston is in England. So they're demanding that he's exiled again. A few months after that, the Boulogne Agreement was kind of produced as a declaration in Parliament. So they're trying to give legal weight to this idea that they've created. And it's kind of unclear whether the magnates are actually hostile to Edward at this point, or whether they're sort of trying to protect him from himself a little bit, whether they're trying to defend the institution of the crown because they're seeing potential problems with Edward. We've spoken about the chroniclers talking about his unusual interests. Clearly that's something that's, concerning the barons at this point. And so in May 1308, Gaveston is sent off into exile again, but he retains his title as Earl of Cornwall. And the issue, the reason I'm tying this into the marriage to Isabella, is because although Gaveston is given this position of prominence at the coronation, it's kind of lavished with gifts and offices, and everybody hates Gaveston, and Edward is adamant he's going to defend Gaveston. It's really hard to see Isabella ever having an issue with Gaveston. There's no evidence that she particularly took against him, that she didn't, that she despised the kind of influence that he had over her husband. Whether that's because she's arrived into this situation where her husband already has perhaps a physical relationship with Piers, and she accepts that, and that's part of their relationship and their marriage. Whether she understands simply that Piers has influence over the king that she can't replicate, and that the barons are trying to resist this and they're turning Edward against them, and she can't afford to do that perhaps in her position. So it's weird because we know that Gaveston has all of this influence over the king and is perhaps in a physical relationship with him, but Isabella doesn't seem put out by it. We know kings have mistresses and their wives don't say anything. Perhaps this is the same kind of deal going on, that Isabella is simply accepting the fact that this is who Edward is. This is what English politics looks like at the moment, and it's not causing her personal problem. And on the flip side too, there is very little evidence of Edward treating Isabella, at least early in their relationship, with malice or without care. He does seem to care for her quite deeply. He does some things that I think probably fall into the category of him just being a man, and he does things that are stupid, but probably doesn't really mean to cause harm or upset. Later on, we'll get to the bit, but he takes some lands away from her and replaces it with an income, and that's frowned upon. But again, Isabella doesn't particularly seem to get too fazed by it. She seems to accept what's going on. And we get these. We also get these nice little windows into their relationship. So at one point when they're in Scotland, they're in France, visiting Isabella's brother a few years later, their tent somehow catches on fire in the middle of the night. No one's quite sure. No one ever talks about how the king's tent caught on fire, but maybe it was just a stray brazier. I don't know. But the chroniclers kind of wonder at what happens next. So this tent is going up in flames. There's smoke billowing everywhere. And all of a sudden this figure bursts out from the tent, and it's Edward II, stark naked. Clearly he's sleeping naked, but he's also sleeping with his wife because he's carrying Isabella out of the tent in his arms.
Wow.
He's stark naked, carrying her away from this fire, and they're clearly they're in there together.
Yeah.
So there is a closeness in their relationship. The fact that he may have had a physical relationship with Piers doesn't seem to have impeded or affected his physical relationship with his wife either. So it's a really complex set of circumstances and personalities, and Isabella has a really key role to play in all of that. And for all that I've kind of said, she seems to be okay with all of this, that doesn't mean that she's this kind of meek and mild woman. She very definitely isn't that. She knows her worth, she knows her position, she knows her own importance, and she isn't afraid to make a stand when she needs to.
Sounds like she has a level of confidence that
Yeah, I think so. She's the King of France's daughter.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she's been brought up to understand that means a lot. This is at a point when the kings of France are desperately trying to position themselves as the most important monarchs in Europe. So she knows she has prestige.
I find it interesting when you talked about the story about the tent catching on fire. That would have been a perfect opportunity for Edward II just to run out on his own and leave her behind and be like, oh, I guess my wife died in the fire. But he didn't.
That's it. He actively chooses not to do that. And I think, he does care for Isabella. If he's having a physical relationship with Piers Gaveston, he's definitely bisexual rather than homosexual. He has an illegitimate child as well,
Right.
So it's not that he's choosing to shun women. It's not even that he's just sleeping with Isabella as a form of dynastic duty to produce a son. He has an illegitimate son with a mistress as well. So if anything, he's bisexual if he's having those physical relationships with men, which I suspect he probably is. So it's complex, and we can't simply say that because he's so attached to Piers Gaveston, he kind of hates his wife and, my wife doesn't understand me. There's none of that going on. I think there is a striking closeness in their relationship, and they do seem to care for each other.
Yeah, I like that part of the story, at least. Okay, I kind of want to get an idea too. Can we look at Edward II's siblings? Because I feel like it's always so important to see what's going on in the family around. So who were his surviving siblings at this point, and did they have any effect on his reign?
So at this point, as we've mentioned, he has no surviving brothers. He's the last male of his parents' first marriage, so he does have half siblings that we'll include as well. But he does have 4 surviving sisters. So he's got Joan of Acre, who was born in Acre while her parents were there on crusade, and she gets married to the Earl of Gloucester, so one of the senior members of the nobility in England. He has another sister, Margaret, who is the Duchess of Brabant, so she's married to the Duke of Brabant. He's got Mary, who becomes a nun, so doesn't get married, doesn't have any children.
Hopefully, right?
Yeah. And the youngest sister, they're all older than him. He's the youngest child. The other sister is Elizabeth of Rutland, who's again born in Rutland in Wales. And she marries the Earl of Hereford. So again, another fairly senior member of the nobility. And then he also has kind of three half siblings, but the youngest of them, a sister, Eleanor, doesn't live very long. She dies when she's 5 years old. But he has 2 younger half brothers, so Thomas and Edmund. They're the result of his father's second marriage to Margaret of France. Thomas becomes Earl of Norfolk and Edmund becomes Earl of Kent. So, they're kind of there to bolster him. So he has a bit of family support around him. And to some extent, although, he has half brothers, it might be fair to say he doesn't really have the same kind of rivals to his claim that others might have had to endure. His 2 half brothers don't ever make an attempt on his throne or anything like that. They're not a kind of dynastic threat to him, which puts him in a fairly good position in that there is very little challenge. He's got this kind of network of family around him, but he doesn't have to worry about a brother, a full brother who is necessarily going to claim his throne and cause him problems.
It kind of surprises me, to be honest with you, that he had these half brothers and that they were never rallied behind to replace Edward. It kind of surprises me. It seems like that seems to be a pattern in history.
Yeah, absolutely. When we get to the end of his reign, his half brothers are in opposition to him at that point. But this is kind of 20 years on, and they're neither of them are trying to claim the throne. They're not trying to make themselves king. And when we get there, I'll argue that I think probably the aim of all of that happened in 1326 was never really to depose Edward. I think that's the doing of Roger Mortimer because of his own position. So although Edmund and Thomas kind of join this assault on England that's led by Isabella, I'm not entirely convinced that they were all thinking, right, we're going to get Edward off the throne and replace him at that point. And definitely Edmund and Thomas are not thinking we're going to make ourselves king at that point.
Okay, we have to talk about that because I feel like that is the biggest part of his story, is this uprising against him. When do things begin to shift between him and his wife that this happens?
I mean, it's the result of another favourite who causes all kinds of problems, Hugh Despencer the Younger. So in 1312, Piers Gaveston is he gets another spell in exile, he comes back again. But in 1312, the barons have kind of had enough of him, and they end up seizing him. They arrest him, and they drag him to the top of a hill in Warwickshire, and he's executed. And this is largely done by the Earl of Lancaster, and that's important because he's a big figure in this story too. But Piers is denied an opportunity to speak in his own defence. He is forced to kneel at the top of this hill. He's run through by some Welsh soldier, and then another man at arms chops his head off. So it's a fairly ignominious kind of end for the Earl of Cornwall, for the king's favourite. And it's something that Edward never, ever gets over. The strength of his commitment to Piers' memory is strongly suggestive that this is more than just a friendship. He will spend the rest of his life mourning Piers and going after the people who caused Piers' downfall. So we know on the following year, the first anniversary of Gaveston's murder, Edward was in France. He was in Pontoise, and he spent the evening kind of being entertained by a man named Bernard the Fool and 44 naked dancers.
Oh.
And this was about a week after that incident where the tent had caught fire. So,
Wow.
After Gaveston's execution. And Edward, he seems to constantly mark the anniversary of Gaveston's death in some way. But he gets, over the years that follow, kind of the 1310s, he develops attachments to a few other men, who are kind of called favourites. There's one called Roger Damery, there's a Hugh Audley, there's a William Montacute, and a couple of others. But as soon as the barons kind of kick off and ask him to send these people away, he does it willingly. He's definitely nowhere near as attached to these people as he had been to Piers Gaveston. But it possibly points to a weakness in Edward's personality, or something, whether it's a weakness or not, I don't know, but something in his personality, this need to have someone around him who is kind of supporting him or egging him on or giving him the confidence that he needs to be king. He clearly feels like he kind of can't do it on his own. He can't even just do it with Isabella. He needs somebody there who is propping him up.
Yeah.
He goes through periods of difficulty. The barons kind of end up putting his cousin Thomas, the Earl of Lancaster, in charge of the government. They sort of force Edward to take a step back from government. Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, is kind of put in as effectively regent. He's put in charge of the government, except that it turns out he's as bad at it as Edward is. He doesn't really want to do it. He just sits in the north and kind of twiddles his thumbs and doesn't do very much. But nevertheless, he's nominally in charge of the kingdom for most of the 1310s. This kind of all kicks off with the emergence of the Despencer family. So there is Hugh Despencer the elder and Hugh Despencer the younger, because everybody calls everybody the same name.
Yeah, of course.
So to differentiate them, we have a father and son, the elder and the younger. Hugh the elder seems to be someone that lots of people didn't particularly get on with. The Despencer family have been developing holdings lands around the Welsh Marches, which is a fractious region out on the border, kind of bit of a Wild West of medieval England, a little bit unruly. The royal writ doesn't necessarily run there very strongly. And so they've been making enemies by, snatching bits of land and whatever else. And at some point, and it's unclear exactly when and how this happens, Hugh Despencer the Younger becomes becomes attached to Edward II. And Edward develops this relationship with Hugh that is so similar to Gaveston. It's the other kind of really, really strong connection that he has during this period. All of those other people that he's been sending away, we're going to see him behaving very differently with Hugh Despenser the Younger, very much more like he did with Gaveston. And the issue here is that Gaveston, people didn't like him, but they didn't like him because of the influence he had over the king.
Yeah.
Not because he was necessarily a horrible person. Hugh Despenser the Younger seems to be someone who everybody genuinely despises, irrespective of his connection to Edward, irrespective of any influence that he might have. And I quite often say, when people say to me, is there a medieval person you'd like to be in the room with, and expect me to say Richard III, I quite often say it might be Hugh Despenser the Younger, because I'd love to understand what it is about him that it seems like nobody could like this man. He seems so vile. And I kind of want to understand why it is that nobody could like him, because it doesn't seem to be his influence over Edward, or at least not solely that. So we end up in this situation where what is called the Despenser Wars begins in 1321, because the Earl of Lancaster, who's effectively in control of the government, seems to have had a personal feud with Hugh the Elder going on. Although there doesn't seem to have been that issue to start off with his son. That kind of emerges. But yeah, 1321, we get this period called the Despenser Wars kick off. A load of the Marcher Lords in Wales attack the Despenser properties, their castle at Newport in particular. When they can't make any progress in August 1321, all of these Marcher Lords march on London. They enter the capital. And in the middle of August 1321, they meet with Edward at Westminster Hall. And they're in such a position of power that they force Edward to agree to the exile of both Hugh the Elder and Hugh the Younger. Hugh the Elder took a ship and sailed across the Channel off into the continent somewhere. Hugh the Younger seems to have engaged in a bout of piracy off the south coast of England. And it's doubtful that he ever actually left England at all, even though he was exiled. And almost certainly this is because Edward would have told him, don't go far, because this isn't going to last very long.
Yeah.
Because before the end of the year, so in December 1321, Edward issues safe conducts to both Hugh Despenser the Elder and Hugh Despenser the Younger to come back to England again. And then in early 1322, he issues writs for the arrest of all of those Marcher Lords who had forced him to exile the Despensers. So he's now in kind of full revenge mode. He's brought them back from exile double quick and is setting out to persecute the people who had caused him to send Hugh away. And doubtless, it's possible that he was kind of traumatized by what had happened to Piers Gaveston, and having developed this similar connection to Hugh Despenser the Younger, that he's scared of that happening again. He's scared of the position that he found himself in 10 years earlier. And I strongly suspect there's much less evidence here that this is the same kind of loving relationship, that it was the same kind of physical relationship, but it has a lot of the same elements of the relationship with Gaveston. And if Hugh Despenser is as vile as everybody seemed to think he was, it's interesting to wonder whether he's playing on those insecurities and weaknesses of the king, whether he is kind of playing mind games with Edward II to inveigle himself into the king's inner circle and make himself more and more powerful. Because Gaveston got stuff from the king. He got made Earl of Cornwall, and he got this and that and something else. But he never seems to have gone after those things. It seems to be more Edward kind of lavishing these things on him. Whereas in Hugh Despenser the Younger, you've got someone who is coming in kind of with a list of demands. I want this, 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 and this, and I will kind of do anything you want me to do to be able to get them. So they head out after all of these Marcher Lords. So Roger Mortimer, who is a famous name in this story, who's going to come to prominence very soon. Roger Mortimer and his uncle, guess what his uncle's called?
Roger
Mortimer. So both Rogers decide to surrender themselves to the king at this point. Roger Mortimer had previously had a good relationship with Edward II. They'd worked well together. He'd been a good servant to the crown. The kind of Despenser Wars were a blot on his copybook, but a bit of a blip. And so he and his uncle decide to surrender to the king and sort of throw themselves on Edward's mercy. And they're locked up in the tower to start off with. Others of the rebel lords flee north towards the lands of Thomas, the Earl of Lancaster, hoping that he will protect them, particularly because he doesn't get on with Hugh the Elder. In March 1322, so 16th of March 1322, those fleeing north are intercepted by a man named Andrew Harclay, who is the sheriff of Cumberland, and they fight the Battle of Boroughbridge. And this is literally fought on a bridge, and we get one of those kind of classic fought on a bridge stories, in which Humphrey de Bohun, the Earl of Hereford, is killed. We're told by someone who sneaks underneath the bridge and shoves a spear up into his stomach, so that it's the chronicles tell us that his intestines just fall out all over the bridge, and he collapses and dies, unsurprisingly.
Oh, that's brutal.
Yeah. So a whole load of them are captured, and several of the rebels are executed. They also move on and arrest Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, and he's taken to be put on trial. And he's brought before Edward, his cousin Edward, wearing a servant's tunic, so designed to embarrass the Earl of Lancaster, the most significant nobleman in the country, who is, in name at least, been running the country for the better part of 10 years, is forced to wear servant's clothes when he's brought before the king. He's kind of put on trial for a whole list of crimes that go back to 1312, coincidentally the year in which Gaveston was executed. So we know what Edward is doing here. He wants revenge for what happened to Piers Gaveston. And Lancaster is denied the opportunity to speak in his own defence, just as he had denied Gaveston the opportunity to speak in his own defence. And he's found guilty, unsurprisingly. He's sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered. That's commuted to beheading. And I don't know how much of that was mercy and how much of that was actually about recreating Gaveston's execution. Because very shortly after that, before the end of March 1322, Lancaster he's put on the back of a mule. He's ridden to a hilltop, and according to one account, the Earl of Lancaster kneels and faces east towards Jerusalem, towards the Holy Land, for his execution. And Edward's men turn him round and force him to face north towards Scotland. And part of the charges that Edward II had laid against him was that he was conspiring with Scotland to work against Edward. So he's denied the ability to face towards the Holy Land for his execution. He's instead forced to face north, and a lowly man at arms is called forward to cut his head off. So this is almost recreating Gaveston's execution for Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. It couldn't be more clear what Edward is doing and what he's aiming to achieve here. The problem that Edward then almost immediately has is that a cult springs up around Thomas, as if he's some kind of martyr. And there are calls to canonize him and all sorts of stuff that Edward II then has to kind of fight to resist, because he can't have him becoming another Becket kind of issue for him at this point, the saint that he executed. A couple of months after this, in the summer of 1322, Roger Mortimer and his uncle are both put on trial. They're sentenced to death, but that sentence is immediately commuted to life imprisonment in recognition of the fact that they had surrendered and given themselves up, and they'd not continued to fight against Edward. But a year later, on the 1st of August 1323, which is the feast of St. Peter ad Vincula, who's the patron saint of the Tower of London, there's a bit of a party going on. Roger is in that kind of custody that noblemen enjoy, in which you can have barrels of wine brought into the tower and you can have parties and stuff. So he throws a bit of a party for the feast of St. Peter ad Vincula, gets all of his guards absolutely legless. They pass out drunk, to the point that there's some suggestion that they were actually drugged as well. And Roger manages to escape from the tower. One of the sources says he climbs up a chimney in the kitchens. They use some rope ladders to get over the outside walls of the tower. There's a boat waiting for them on the Thames, and they sail off into exile in France, and he ends up at the French court.
Wow.
So Edward now has, a problem in that there's a rebel somewhere in the French court. But it doesn't come to a head. This is 1323. 1324, the relationship with France begins to go a little bit wonky. As I mentioned, Isabella, 3 of her brothers are kings of France in fairly quick succession. We get Louis X, who actually does have a son, John I, but he's only king for 4 days. He dies at 4 days old.
Oh, wow.
He dies at 4 years old after being king of France for 4 days. So he dies 4 days after his dad. And he's succeeded by Philip V, and then Charles IV becomes king in 1322. And 1324. So each of these changes of French king requires Edward II to go over and do homage, to swear fealty to the King of France for Gascony, for the lands in the southwest of France that he owns. And no king likes to go and have to give homage to another king. It's a real bugbear for kings of England at this point. So for Edward II, this is now getting annoying. You know, this is like the third time
He's like,
you're making me
again?
come over there and do it. Yeah, exactly.
Can't you guys live a little longer? I'm tired of making this journey.
Yeah, you're embarrassing me, you're making me look bad. So by 1324, he's kind of putting off going and doing homage to Charles IV. And Charles IV seizes Gascony and says, if you don't come and do homage, I'm just going to take it off you. And it's at this point also that, as I mentioned before, Edward takes a load of Isabella's lands in Cornwall off her and replaces it with an income from the exchequer. So he gives her the money back, but by taking away her land, he's kind of decreasing her independence. So she's now reliant on money coming out of Edward's exchequer rather than income from lands that she is in control of. And I can't help wondering at this point whether, those Cornish lands had once belonged to Gaveston. He'd been made Earl of Cornwall. And I can't help wondering whether Hugh Despencer the Younger is now, whispering in Edward's ear, what if I was Earl of Cornwall? What if I had all of those lands? And this is a moment where I think Edward is doing this, not to deliberately harm or embarrass Isabella, and probably ignorant of the fact that he's likely to be causing that offence. He's just doing it because he's a stupid bloke. He doesn't understand what he's doing. Yeah. But you can see how that would concern Isabella. And Isabella, I think, by this point, is in the same camp as everybody else, that she can't stand Hugh Despencer the Younger, in a way that she never seemed to have despised Gaveston or any of the others of Edward's favourites. There, like I say, there is something very different about Hugh Despencer the Younger, and even Isabella is like absolutely not having this.
Yeah, it makes you wonder.
So,
I'm with you on that one.
What is it about this man? I'm so interested what it is, because you would struggle to find. I don't know how much his dad liked him. I don't know. But he seems to be a pretty vile character. And so I can't help wondering whether this confiscation or this removal of lands in Cornwall was maybe about making Hugh Despencer the Younger the next Gaveston, giving him an earldom and loads of lands down in Cornwall. And that seems to have been a breaking point for Isabella as much as anybody else. So early the next year in 1325, she heads over to France to negotiate with her brother, Charles IV, to try and find a peace between her husband and her brother, who are effectively at war at the moment. She negotiates a treaty to which Edward agrees, that says Gascony will be returned as long as Edward goes and swears fealty by the end of August 1325. So he's kind of got 6 months to get to France and swear fealty, and he can have Gascony back. Otherwise, he accepts that he's going to give it up for good. So as we get kind of a week before that date, Edward II is making preparations to head over to France, kind of resigned he's going to have to go and do this whole embarrassing homage thing for the third time. But then a few days before he's due to set off, he writes to Charles IV and says, mate, I'm really ill. I'm calling in sick. I can't travel. It was probably a lie. He's probably slightly panicking about leaving England, because if he leaves Hugh Despencer behind, he's probably going to get murdered by everybody.
Oh,
because that's what happened to Gaveston, and everybody hates Despencer more than they hated Gaveston. So again, I think you can see that kind of that trauma, that fear playing on Edward's mind. I can't leave. I can't take him to France, because probably Isabella will get Charles to arrest him while he's in France and he'll get killed. I can't leave him in England because all of his enemies here will kill him as soon as I'm gone and I'm not here to protect him. So I doubt that he was ill, and I think he was more really, really stuck and not sure how to proceed with all of this. But on the 30th of August, so the day after he was due to give this fealty, he starts his preparations again. as if he's going to travel, made a full recovery. I'm definitely going to travel. He appoints his 12-year-old son, who's called Edward. Surprise, surprise. Edward of Windsor, Prince Edward. He appoints Prince Edward as regent for the time that he's out of the country. But then a couple of days after this, so in early September, he makes Prince Edward Count of Ponthieu with the intention that he can now go over and do homage to Charles IV instead.
Oh.
So this other option is that someone, a prince goes and does homage on behalf of the king. That's not unheard of. It's a way of the king getting out of doing it. And sort of a week later, so 10th of September, he further creates Edward as Duke of Aquitaine. So strengthening his position. He's now the kind of Duke of the area that Gascony covers. And he makes arrangements for Prince Edward to travel to France to do this homage for him. And we're told that Edward II kind of really impresses on his son that if he leaves the kingdom, he must not, under any circumstances, allow himself to be married. This is something that Edward II seems to fixate on. He's clearly, again, he's aware of the risks of sending his son out of the country at a point where he has enemies in France. Because if they marry him off to someone who makes an alliance against him, that's going to cause Edward II all kinds of problems. So he's kneeling down in front of this 12-year-old boy saying, whatever you do, don't get married without my permission.
Did anybody go with him over? Like, did he have some guardian or anything type of thing?
There would have been a decent entourage traveling with him. He is the Prince of Wales. He's the Prince of England. He's there. He's going to be in France to impress. So he'll have an entourage with him. His mom is still in France at the moment, so he's going over there to meet his mom, who also will have her entourage with her as well. So it's going to be a fairly big English contingent in France at this point. But before the end of September, Prince Edward performs this homage to Charles IV for Gascony. And that seems like, job done. They can all go back to England now, except that they don't. And then it's at this point that we get Edmund of Woodstock. So the Earl of Kent, Edward's younger half-brother, heads over to France as well. And he's clearly now had enough, both of Edward and Hugh Despencer the Younger. Even Edward's half-brothers have reached the point where they're moving away from their half-brother. They've been loyal to him throughout his reign up until this point. Hugh Despencer the Younger, I cannot emphasize this enough. Hugh is the problem.
Yeah, clearly.
And we get this letter from Isabella to England, in which she writes, and again, it's another quote I wrote down because it's just such a striking moment for the Queen of England to say this. But she says to Edward, I protest that I will not return until this intruder is removed, but discarding my marriage garment shall assume the robes of widowhood and mourning.
Oh.
So she now begins to behave in France as if her husband is dead. She's dressing in a way that says, you are dead to me until Hugh Despencer the Younger is gone.
This is serious.
I'm not coming home. I'm not coming home, and your son is not coming home. Your heir is out of your control. And the only thing that all you have to do to get him back is get rid of Hugh Despencer the Younger. That's all that Isabella is asking him to do. But it's the one thing that Edward can't do. I don't think it's a case of he doesn't want to. There is some kind of emotional stuff going on with Edward that I think means he can't envisage a world now without Hugh Despencer the Younger at his side. So in early 1326, Edward issues a proclamation ordering preparations to be made for an invasion from France. He in this proclamation, he says the Queen will not come to the king nor permit his son to return. I mean, that's pretty embarrassing for the King of England to say. Excuse me for saying this, but I can't control my wife, and I don't have control of my son and heir.
Right.
And he's openly saying that to everybody in England. It's crazy.
How embarrassing for him.
Yeah, I think it is. And in March, he writes a letter to Charles IV of France, and to his son Prince Edward. And again, he pleads with Edward not to allow himself to get married without his father's permission. And he tells Charles in this letter that he understands that Isabella is keeping company with Mortimer, quote, within and without house. So is he suggesting here that they are now lovers?
Yeah.
I don't know whether he knows, whether he's just suspecting this, whether he's slinging a bit of mud her way. I don't know. But again, he's basically telling the King of France, your sister. That's not a word I can think of to use here. That's polite. But I mean, you're telling the King of France that his sister is cheating on you and is up to no good.
Yeah.
It's not a good diplomatic move, really. And he also, he pretty much begs Charles IV to send Prince Edward home. Isabella won't send him home. Please, 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 will you send him home? This is such a weak position for Edward to find himself in.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, there's nothing like looking like a weak king when you're begging for your son and maybe your wife to come home.
Yeah, and he either doesn't seem to recognize that or care about that, because he's just making these proclamations everywhere that, my wife's run away from me. I can't get access to my own son, who's the heir to the kingdom. I'm begging the King of France to send them home. I'm pretty sure she's having an affair with Roger Mortimer. He's just openly saying all of this stuff.
Yeah.
But he will not rid himself of Hugh Despencer, despite all of this, despite the opportunities that Isabella is giving him to put this right. He won't do it. And so again, I don't think this is necessarily hostility from Isabella towards Edward, so much as it's hostility towards Hugh Despencer the Younger. And she is very clearly saying, I've tolerated everything that's gone before. This is something I can't tolerate. And for some reason, Edward can't comprehend that means something is different now. He can't take Isabella's stance that she's willing to make here as a signal that something unusual, something out of the ordinary is going on with Hugh Despencer. He's so attached to him.
Like he can't even imagine something is going to go wrong. Like everything's going to be fine. Nothing's going to go wrong.
Itself out. And probably Hugh Despencer the Younger is telling him, as long as I'm here with you, you're safe and everything will be fine. That's the kind of influence I imagine Hugh Despencer is having over Edward at this point, that he's pulling all of the king's strings and doing everything that he can to protect himself. And so, kind of late September 1326, we get this landing in England of Isabella, of Prince Edward, of Roger Mortimer, and of the king's half-brother, the Earl of Kent. And they land with about 1,000 men in Suffolk. As soon as they land, Edward's other half-brother, Thomas, the Earl of Norfolk, joins up with them and is now in open opposition to the king. The bishops of Hereford, Lincoln, Ely, and a couple of others throw their lot in with the rebels as well. They've had enough of Edward. And Henry, who is the Earl of Lancaster now, who is Thomas's brother, the executed Thomas's brother, is also very quick to join this rebellion for reasons that might well be obvious. It's not funny, but it's kind of funny. On the 28th of September, Edward issues a proclamation putting a bounty of £1,000 on Roger Mortimer's head. He can't go after the Queen and he can't go after his son. He probably doesn't want to go after his half-brothers. Roger Mortimer is the man he can target in all of this. So 28th of December, he puts a bounty of £1,000 on Roger Mortimer's head. The next day, the 29th of December, Isabella puts a bounty of £2,000 on Hugh Despencer the Younger's head. They're kind of in a bidding war for who's going to kill them off. And, you imagine Edward being like, £1,000 bounty and Isabella going, okay, 2,000.
Yeah, I like that.
And a few days after that, on the 2nd of October, Edward is so scared that everything is going horribly wrong that he flees London. He just runs away with Hugh Despencer the Younger. They go to Chepstow Castle, so they're heading towards Wales. Hugh Despencer the Elder kind of barricades himself in at his castle at Bristol. By late October, Edward and Hugh the Younger are at Cardiff Castle, so they're making their way through Wales. And on the 26th of October, Hugh the Elder they managed to break the castle at Bristol. Hugh Despencer the Elder is arrested, and he's put on trial in a manner that is designed to replicate Thomas Earl of Lancaster's trial, which was designed to replicate Piers Gaveston's trial. Yeah. So there is this cycle of performative revenge going on, except that he's not actually beheaded. He's not given the right to speak in his own defence at his trial. but they don't commute his sentence. And he is hanged at the age of 56, wearing his full armour. He's put in his full suit of armour, and he's hanged on the gallows in Bristol. Once he's dead, once he's died from the hanging, his corpse is beheaded. His head is carried to Winchester and put on display, and his body is fed to a pack of dogs.
Whoa.
I mean, it's getting full Game of Thrones stuff going on here. There is absolutely zero respect for enemies at this point. Hugh is executed in a way, that his rank should have precluded. He is hanged as if he is a common criminal. And then, he's denied a burial, a Christian burial, because his body is fed to a bunch of dogs.
I'm
Edward
just blown. I'm
Hugh,
sorry. I feel like I'm so blown away. This all started with Gaveston. It's like the revenge snowball keeps growing larger and larger.
It is, yeah. And while all of this is going on, kind of Edward and Hugh the Younger are continuing to make their way through Wales. And in the middle of November, Edward and Hugh are caught with only a few men with them, and reportedly, just wandering through the Welsh countryside by this point, aimlessly, pretty much lost, haven't really got a clue what they're trying to do, but they're apprehended. Edward is taken to Kenilworth Castle in the Midlands, a property that belongs to the Earls of Lancaster. Might tell
Here we go.
Where this is heading.
Yeah.
But he is treated with great respect. So he's forced to hand over the Great Seal, so the instrument of government, the ways in which royal proclamations are issued and all of that kind of thing. He's forced to hand that over to his son, Prince Edward, on the premise that Edward is going to rule in place of his father, is kind of going to head the government up. But he's otherwise treated with respect. There's not a sense at this point that they're going to remove him as king. But then we begin to see a little round of reprisals from Roger Mortimer. So some of his enemies, most notably the Earl of Arundel, end up being executed as traitors. So Mortimer is now having a little mopping up exercise now that he's got power alongside Isabella. So Prince Edward is still kind of 12 or 13 years old. And so Isabella and Mortimer are sort of actually holding power in the kingdom at this point. And Roger Mortimer is getting a bit of revenge. And this is where I think it's Roger Mortimer who is driving the desire to remove Edward. Because I think he, as I mentioned before, Edward II is never going to go after Isabella. He's never going to go after his own son, the heir to the throne. He's unlikely to go after his own half-brothers. The one person in that group who has to fear Edward's vengeance if he's returned to power is Roger Mortimer. Yeah. And so I think he is the one who is now driving things. I think Isabella's plan was to get rid of Hugh Despenser the Younger, which incidentally she does. We've had a gory execution for the dad. The son is, if anything, worse. So when he and Edward are captured, Hugh Despenser is taken to Hereford, and Isabella is planning to take him to London to undergo a big public show trial. So Hugh Despenser goes on hunger strike because he clearly doesn't want to go and be embarrassed in this huge trial in London. So he's instead swiftly put on trial in Hereford, so that he can be executed publicly before he starves himself to death. He's put on a horse, ridden through the town with his coat of arms reversed, which is a sign of a traitor. And he's also bizarrely has a crown of nettles jammed onto his head, which is a really weird, odd thing that they're doing, perhaps pointing to his desire to control the crown, to control the king. I don't know. But he's then taken to a 50-foot high set of gallows that's been erected in Hereford Centre specifically for this purpose. 50-foot high so that everybody who wants to see it can see it. So he's raised above the crowd and everyone gets a really good view. He's hanged from those gallows until he's almost dead. He's cut down while he's still alive, strapped to a ladder, again facing the crowd up in the air so that everybody can see him. His stomach is sliced open from top to bottom. His intestines are pulled out and thrown into a brazier next to him, so a fire that's burning next to him. So you can smell his insides burning as he's slowly sinking into the shock that his body is feeling. His genitals are then cut off and also thrown into the fire in front of him while he's still conscious and able to see this. And then just as he's at the point where he can't take anymore, he is beheaded and his body is then quartered. His head is mounted on London Bridge and the four quarters of his body are sent to Carlisle, York, Bristol and Dover. So literally the four corners of England.
Yeah.
And it takes 4 years before those parts of his body are reunited and he's buried at Tewkesbury Abbey. You know, his tomb is still at Tewkesbury Abbey today, but that's only 4 years after, you know, they round up the rotted remains of his 5 parts of his body, the 4 quarters and his head, and inter them at Tewkesbury Abbey. So he's met a gory end as well. Isabella has got rid of Hugh Despenser. I think that was her aim. And I think at worst, she would have thought we'll sideline Edward II and we'll have Prince Edward as the figurehead of government. But, you know, we're not going to remove Edward II. So Edward III, Prince Edward will be kind of regent, if you like. And maybe eventually Edward II will come back to power. So I think that's probably Isabella's plan. Roger Mortimer is the man with a very different idea because he's the one that Edward is going to come after if he ever wants revenge for this. And we know Edward will want revenge because we've seen him spend 10 years getting vengeance for Gaveston.
Yeah.
So imagine what he's going to do to the people who got rid of Hugh Despenser the younger. He's going to do exactly the same.
Yeah.
So it's kind of early in 1327 in January, Parliament opens and all of a sudden they're talking about how you depose a king. And this isn't something that's ever been done in England. They don't have a mechanism for it. They don't really know how to do it. They decide to do it through Parliament. You know, Edward I, as we mentioned last time, has kind of made Parliament this vehicle for legal legitimacy, for standardising laws. So they decide Parliament is the best place to go to kind of give this some kind of legal standing. And it must have been a done deal because before the end of January, a delegation is sent to Edward at Kenilworth Castle to tell him that he's no longer King of England. Wow. And the rolls record that when he's told this, again, I've pulled this quote out because I think this gives us a real insight into Edward, and I think it's actually quite a sad quote. But he's reported that when he was told that he was deposed, that he was no longer King of England, that he was going to be replaced by his son, he replied, "I greatly lament that I have so utterly failed my people, but I could not be other than I am."
Wow. It kind of gave me chills.
It is. And I think it's quite touching, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's just like, I've just been me. And clearly me is so awful that you guys can't put up with it anymore. And I'm sorry.
Oh my gosh. I've never heard that quote.
There's no kind of throwing a fit. There's no kind of loss of temper that how dare they behave like this. There's almost a recognition of him saying, I've done a bad job and I'm sorry, but I did my best.
Yeah.
The things that have limited me are just the things that make me who I am. And so on the 25th of January, 1327, officially the reign of King Edward III starts. Edward is then referred to in sources from then on as Sir Edward of Carnarvon. So after the place that he's born, he just becomes he's still a knight. So he's still entitled to call himself a Sir. And he's named Edward of Carnarvon after the place that he's born. And you might expect for that to be the end of his story, but there's so much more that goes on after that. And I don't know whether you want to talk about that now, whether you want to save that for an Edward III episode.
Yeah, you know what? I feel like maybe we should save that for the Edward III episode. I think that's a good build up to start that one out. I can't even tell you. I feel like this episode has been a roller coaster ride. I can't. It was obvious to me I did not know very much about Edward II, only some of the stories about how he died, basically, and his wife and Mortimer. But today I feel like I went on this roller coaster, and I feel for Edward II a bit, but also see that he made mistakes. And that quote just proves that he's just human. He's just a man who made poor decisions. And it led to the people closest to him dying or pulling away from him.
Yeah. And I think the striking thing about that, the most touching thing is perhaps at the end there, he recognises that. If he'd recognised that a little bit earlier when Isabella was giving him all of those chances, he could have pulled this out of the fire.
Yeah.
He could have solved this problem. And I think there is a recognition in him that he's caused this. This is no one's fault but his own. And that just the way that he is, the person that he is, has meant that he can't do this job as King of England. And there is that recognition of it. And I think this is what distinguishes him from bad kings like John, in that, you know, John is an idiot. John is a horrible, terrible person.
He would never
Edward
apologize.
No,
Yeah.
he wouldn't. He never, ever would do that. Edward is not that person. Yes, he fails as a king. Yes, his reign is problematic, and he is by no measure a good king, but he's not a bad man.
Yeah. I can't thank you enough for, I don't know, humanizing Edward II for me, for really bringing him out of the pages of history and showing me who he was as a man. So thank you so much, Matt. I look forward to the next episode on Edward III, where we can finish Edward II's story and find out more about his son and what his reign was like.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Be fun.
All right. Well, we'll see you again in a week.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/tudorsdynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. Join the conversation with Rebecca on social media at Tudors Dynasty. Until next time.